Brothers and sisters, it is so good to, you get dizzy if you do this too much. It's so good to see your faces again today. And for time, I just want to introduce Jack and Lisa Reese. I could say a million things. Can we give them another round of applause? I could say a lot about their gifts, what they've done, their offerings to the body. I got to stay with them a couple of months ago at their home in San Antonio. They are the warmest, kindest, most loving people. Such a connection with them, and to hear their heart. Jack, your book has profoundly affected many of us. I think your voice is super important, and the way you carry it is profound. So I actually don't want to spend any more time. I want you all to see what Jack is like through what he shares. So Jack, would you please come on stage? And brother, if I might, can I pray? So Father of heavenly lights, God of glory, consuming fire, we invite you, the fullness of your presence. We know you are here. Would you attune us to your presence? Would you open our ears, our minds, and our hearts? And would you give Jack your voice? May we be encouraged at the realities. May we be able to sit under challenge. And may our gaze be on you, Jesus, the author and perfecter of life. Thank you for this dear brother and our dear sister Lisa. Thank you for what they're bringing and sharing. We love them. Thank you for them, Jesus, in your beautiful name. Amen.
Amen.
Over to you, brother.
Thanks you. Love you too. Thank you, Josh. Good day. We have an Aussie in our church in San Antonio. In fact, Daz came to a Wednesday night. We have classes and singing and things, and we introduced him to our Aussie, whose name is Troy. And I thought that the whole G'day thing is just a Troy way of being the stereotypical Aussie, because you don't actually say that. And there they were to each other, oh, good day, well, good day. And so even last night, and I'm like, they do say that. Yeah. So just like Lisa and I say, y'all, because we're from Texas. Who was it that tried to say y'all to us last night? I'm trying to remember. It wasn't great, as I recall. It was a great joy having Daz in our home for 3 days. And Allie, we mostly talked about you. The stories that we didn't tell, that Daz told, and that we took in. Yeah. So we're glad to be in your presence. Uncle Kev, thank you for your heart and your generosity toward people and the descendants of people who have not honored you and your people. I come from a nation that has the same original sins. And the predominant culture there, as I suspect is true here, often doesn't recognize the role that we have. There's a book written by a journalist in the U.S. state of South Carolina on the East Coast, called Slaves in the Family, written over a decade ago. Edward Ball is his name. He is a descendant of a plantation owner, which is to say a slave owner, named Thomas Ball. And what Edward Ball did was to find all the descendants of Thomas Ball, some of whom were white and some of whom were black. And there were horrifying stories among the black descendants because their ancestors had been raped by the plantation owner. And he met with a woman in her 90s, the daughter of a girl who had grown up as a slave. And he kept telling her, "I'm so sorry." And she said, "But you didn't do this. It was your ancestors. You're not responsible." To which Edward Ball says, "I am not responsible, but I am accountable." My ancestors owned slaves. I come from a people who committed mass genocide of the indigenous people of our nation. And I was not there for any of that. I am not responsible. But Uncle Kev, I am accountable. We are accountable for what we do now and how we live now. And so I feel honored to be here in your presence and pay you tribute and honor for the suffering of your people, but also for the graciousness of your heart, because Jesus has touched your life as Jesus has touched ours. Thank you. We are so honored, Lisa and I, to be here among you. I had to remember how all this came about, and I looked through my emails, and on March 23rd of this year, I received an email by a guy named Mark Reese. Where is Mark this morning? There you are. Hey, Mark. I actually had heard your name before I got the email from you, because on Amazon, there were people that were making comments about the book that I had just written, and a couple of them were like people in my church. It was kind of embarrassing, you know. Yeah, okay. And then there was this Aussie there, and I thought, oh, okay, wow, that's kind of interesting. And then, a few weeks later, I got an email from you, and that you had talked to a guy named Darren Farrell, which even now seems funny because I know who it is now, but and you were so kind, and you guys had talked, and then I started corresponding with the two of you, and then I met you in San Antonio as you're working on your doctorate from my alma mater, where I taught for 25 years, and then we got to meet Daz face to face, and all of that is the seedbed for our coming this week. The most important thing I think that we can do with you today and tomorrow is listen and just have conversations with you. We have worked to arrange as much time as we need over these next 2 days just to have conversations with you. Let me tell you a little bit about Lisa, who not only is the love of my life, but she's also extraordinarily gifted. She was also a professor for many years. Her discipline, well, she has two, is education, which is what her doctorate is in, and speech-language pathology, where she was the head of a department and an academic dean. And so she comes not with a lifetime of study and experience in ministry, but she comes with experience in how systems work and when systems fail, and what happens on this side of a system that causes problems on the other side of the system that has repercussions for the generations to come. And she has expertise in strategic planning for institutions, and she's also the head of the adult education committee of our church and has utterly transformed it. That's not my opinion. That's what elders have said to her. So when we have conversations, I hope that you will share with Lisa and let Lisa share with you, because once she starts talking, then you will ignore me and focus on the things that she's saying, which is as it should be. So I'm sorry to embarrass you in this way. I know you love it when I talk about you in public. A couple of you have already said, I haven't read your book. What is this blue hole thing? Which I do get from time to time. Why did you name a book At the Blue Hole? And you know, it's clearer when you read the book what the metaphor is, of course. But I also recognize that many of you, most of you, have not. And so let me just say this briefly, and then share a few things, and then let's see where the day goes. There is a spring of water about 5 or 6 miles from our home in San Antonio that the citizens of San Antonio call the Blue Hole. There are hundreds, I'm sure thousands of blue holes all around the world. And so almost any spring of water someone calls a blue hole. And so San Antonians are not particularly original in that, but that blue hole is important to us because it is the headwaters of the San Antonio River, which is why the city was built there in the first place. It's why the Spanish missions were built there. It's why the city grew up there. And all we see, all we can see is the blue hole. That's all we can see. But the source of the spring is underground. It is what we call the Edwards Aquifer, which is about 150 miles long and about 80 miles wide, and it supplies through various springs and outlets water that provides sustenance for a 3 million population city and about 100 other towns and cities. We can live in San Antonio and just go about our day. We do our work. We water our yard. We just take care of business. We don't even think about it. Underneath us is this massive underground lake. We don't think about it at all unless there's a drought. And then the water table falls, and there's a point at which when it falls enough, the spring does not flow. And then we have to be careful, because if everyone just keeps doing what they've been doing, just watering our yards as much as we want to, the whole system will collapse. The system upon which our entire city is based and literally built on. We are in major drought right now. The water hasn't flowed out of the Blue Hole in months. I found the whole story of the Blue Hole captivating because I thought that's exactly what's going on with our churches. This is exactly what's going on with our churches. We have this massive underground reservoir of grace, of stories, of history, of those who've gone on before. And we live as if none of that matters. Don't even know and don't even care until the drought comes. And then we don't know what to do. What do you do if you don't have water? What do you do? Or said differently, who can we blame? Who's responsible for this? We used to have 200 members just 10 years ago, and we're down to 72. Who did this? For the movement that we share, the Churches of Christ in the United States and the Australian Churches of Christ, we have a common blue hole. The place where the waters came bursting forth from the earth was New Year's weekend, 1831, 1832 in Lexington, Kentucky, when churches from Barton Stone's movement and churches from Alexander Campbell's movement came together to see if they could figure out a way to work together. And those churches were very different, very, very different, in some ways profoundly different from one another. But they believed some things in common, and they felt like that their differences were not as important as what they shared in common. And they decided they would be to one another people of welcome. And that they would form there a community of welcome. Barton Stone and Raccoon John Smith, different streams with different belief systems in profound ways, shook hands and embraced, and they called upon the people to embrace, and a song broke out among them. And the next morning, January 1st, 1832, they came together again and they broke bread. They gathered at the table of welcome. And God made them one and called this people to be a people of unity who would reach out to others of all traditions and be for them what they had been to each other, a community of welcome. I don't know a lot about Australian Churches of Christ. I've done some reading. I've had some conversations. I am not here as an expert on Australian Churches of Christ. You are the experts in Australian Churches of Christ. I'm not here to provide answers for you. I don't know all the problems. I suspect many of our problems are your problems. I don't know all the answers. But I know two things. I know that we share a common DNA, a common set of characteristics, because the stories of your coming together in the 1800s, in part from Great Britain and in part from the U.S., are stories that are rooted in the weekend in 1831 and 1832 in Lexington, Kentucky. We share the same blue hole and the same common characteristics. It was hard to miss last night as Lisa and I listened to your conversations and to the things that you said, these remarkable words that were spoken. We're like, oh, yeah, that's our vocabulary too. We talk like that. Well, not exactly like that, but we share the same blue hole. I know that. And while I don't know about your churches, I do know about dying churches. I know a lot about dying churches. Because churches in the U.S. and churches in Europe and churches in Australia are dying. We don't talk about death very well. Maybe you all do. We don't in my country. We don't talk about it very well. We are can-do people. We can do it. We can figure it out. We can solve this problem. Lisa and I, a few weeks ago, were at a congregation about 3 hours from San Antonio. There was a class that had been reading this book, and they wanted me to come and talk about the book. So I thought I was coming to speak to a class of about 12, and there were about, 115 people in the room, people who wanted to be in the conversation, but they didn't know what the thesis was about. They didn't know anything about the book. I couldn't just have a conversation. And so I spent about a half an hour talking about the death of our churches. Our churches are dying. The diminishment, the dwindling, the crisis that many of our churches face. And there were people in the room, first of all, just raising hands and wanting to comment, and secondly, coming to me afterwards, that basically were saying, nuh-uh, our church isn't dying. I don't know what you're talking about. And one man came up to me afterwards and he said, you're just a pessimist. Well, no, read the book. I promise you I'm not. He said, well, I'm just more optimistic than you are. And I thought, I didn't say this. I was kind, and I listened and gave him a hug. But I thought, it's like someone going to the doctor's office, and the doctor does all the tests, and she says to this patient, you have cancer. And you're going to have surgery and chemotherapy. And the patient says, you're just such a pessimist. No, I don't either. No, I'm going to figure it out. That's crazy at some level. A part of what's happening is, Phyllis Tickle describes in her book, The Great Emergence, which is one of the most important books that I've read in the last 15 years. She lays out in clear and plain and accessible language what scholars have been saying for a while, and that is the cultural West, and in some ways all the world, but certainly the descendants of the Europeans, the cultural West, is going through a cataclysmic change in the whole order of things. And this happens about every 500 years. It's like the entire house is cleaned out and all the old furniture is thrown out and the walls are readjusted. And 500 years ago was the Renaissance and Reformation. And someone who was an adult in 1500, the year 1500, would have lived one way, and his grandchildren would have lived in an entirely different world. Totally different world. Because 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door, and then, and the whole world changed. And they could hardly talk to one another, grandparent and grandchild. And then 500 years before that, the Eastern Church, the Greek Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Western Church, the Roman Church, the Catholic Church, completely separated. Couldn't talk to one another. The worlds were just shattered. And 500 years before that was the fall of the Western Empire, and plunging Europe into all the darkness of the Middle Ages. And 500 years before that was the time of Jesus. And 500 years before that was the great exile of the Babylonian exile, and long before that, the northern kingdom to Assyria. And 500 years before that was David. I mean, about every 500 years, there's this catastrophic set of changes. We are going through massive cultural change. Am I crazy, or is that happening in Australia like it's happening in the U.S.? Are we alone in this? It's been happening for maybe 100 years. What Einstein, among other scientists, were doing a little more than 100 years ago, changing the whole conception of science in the world as we understand it. The Newtonian universe was just blown to bits. World War I and World War II and wars and terrorism and the reconceiving of societies and our understanding of relationships and how we talk and how we relate to one another and what's important and what's not. And allegiance to Christ at some level has been in massive decline for generations, to the point that we can't put our heads in the sand anymore about it. Remember, there's a time, and the times are different, and the chronologies are different, but certainly in Europe and then in the U.S. and in other Western nations around the world and in Australia, in which a Christian belief system was largely supported by centers of cultural power. To say you are a Christian is to say you are a citizen in good standing, and it no longer means that. Because now those who actually believe in the lordship of Christ are marginalized. We're pushed over to the side somewhere. We're not empowered, but we're seen as odd. And our churches are just getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. And that's really good news. It's really good news, or can be. Because as we're pushed to the margins and are ostracized by culture, we find ourselves in this unusual place for the first time in the history of our various cultures, similar to what the earliest Christians were like. You know what the Greek word for witness is? It's the word martyr. The word martyr doesn't mean being killed for a cause. The word martyr just simply means a witness. Why did the word martyr come to mean people being killed for a cause? Because that was the witness of the early church. At Pentecost, immediately after the ascension of Jesus, Remember Acts 1 and Acts 2? You remember how many people there were gathered in the upper room? 120. At the end of Jesus' ministry, that's all the people that were there. 120 is all that Jesus produced in his lifetime. And from there, by teaching and by sacrifice and by suffering and by death and by witness, then it was 500, and then it was 1,000, and then all of a sudden Gentiles were coming on board, and then the missions began to grow, and then people began to die, and they continued to teach, and the gospel was passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation until it came to you. Because people kept dying for this cause. What is a cause that is so great that a people would die? Said differently, would I die? Would I be willing to die for this cause? Or is it just easier to be a member of an institution that does some nice things? The New Testament witness does not back off from the word death. So in Philippians 2, Paul says to the Philippian Christians, you need to be like Jesus, who, though he was with God, did not consider equality with God something to be clung to, but emptied himself, becoming human, taking the form of a servant, was obedient all the way to death. And not just any death, but a cruel and unjust one, executed for crimes he did not commit. So have that in mind among you, Paul says, that. We go too quickly to, therefore God is highly exalted him, giving the name above. That's the extra part. That's the part of that ancient hymn that the church loved to sing. But the reason Paul told that story was because he wants us to be like Jesus, who emptied himself and became a servant and was willing to die. It's a theme that runs all the way through 2 Corinthians. Daz talked about it last night. Always giving ourselves up for death's sake so that life might live in you. Chapter 11 and 12 in 2 Corinthians is one of the most remarkable passages that I've ever known, because part of what's going on in the church of Corinth is that they wanted Paul's credentials. They wanted him to state his credentials because they weren't sure he had the right to tell them what to do. Who are you anyway? You call yourself an apostle? In what way are you an apostle? Where's your resume? And Paul says, I'm not going to give you my resume. I'm not going to boast. I'm not going to boast about my resume. And then in chapter 11, he says, okay, all righty, I will boast. You pushed me into it. I'm going to now. Here are my credentials. I suffered here. I was beaten there. I almost died there. I have been lashed 40 times minus one. I have been bloodied. He says, if I'm going to boast about anything, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. Because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. It's an upside down world. Your church is going to die. Hallelujah. Your church is going to die in one of two ways. My church is dying. It's not just dying in numbers. We're half the size of what we were 10 years ago. Not just dying only in numbers. That's a symptom of the problem. We're either going to die because we are determined we're going to keep doing what we've always done. We're going to make sure that we keep doing, because if it was good enough for my mother, then it's good enough for me. I like the way we used to do it. I love the old hymns. Don't give me all that new stuff with all that, syncopation. Hey, don't give me all that stuff. I just want to sing the songs the way my parents sang them. And I have memories of when I was a child. And all we need is just to put the right programs together. If we can put all the right programs together, and if we can get the right preacher, boy, then they'll start coming. They won't come. They won't. They're not going to come. We will either die of diminishment, getting smaller and smaller and more pathetic until we finally shut the church doors and sell the building and move on, or we will die in an act of community surrender. We will die in an act of congregational discipleship. We will give our lives up for each other. And we will give up our lives for the sake of the world. We will give it up. We will stop coming to church saying, I just didn't get anything out of that. As if the goal of church was to, give me what I like. We come to a point where we don't care whether or not we get what we like. We are communities of welcome. Because God is a God of welcome. Because God is a God of reconciliation. And therefore we become ministers of reconciliation to the world. Churches of Christ in America got off the road that we had been on. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, we took a different path. And it was a path of, you have to be right on all the issues. And when I mean right the way I understand right. And if you're not, then you're not a part of us. We can't have anything to do with you. Our blue hole is a different blue hole. The groundswell of grace beneath us that goes back all the way to the beginning, all the way to Jesus, all the way to creation is groundwater filled, saturated with grace toward one another. And of dying for the sake of a cause greater than we are. I don't know what's best for the churches here. But I do know that we'll never get better until we choose to die for the world and offer our entire church in death for Jesus' sake. Because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. And here is our greatest resource. Of all people, we understand this, because we believe that God does something in baptism. And we, of all people, understand the importance of death and resurrection and the taking of the Lord's Supper, which re-engages us to Christ's death as we partake on Resurrection Day. Of all people, we are a baptism and Lord's Supper people. And if all we think that means is, well, you're supposed to be baptized at, about the right age and say the right words and in the right manner and get everything in the right order, and we take the Lord's Supper because that's what the early disciples did. They did it on Sundays, and so we have to do it. If that's it, if that's all that it is, we've lost the meaning of it all. Baptism is about death and life. Supper is about death and life. Supper and baptism are of the same essence. And so we engage in death. And our churches are offered for the sake of a kingdom cause. And we're willing one way or another to die. And here is, I think, especially good news. Even if we die in the way we would prefer not to, that is, in our diminishment rather than in our discipleship, God can still work through us. Because one thing we know about God, He's really good at resurrection. That's all I got, Des.
Jack, I feel like we could keep listening to you for a long time. I don't even know how to stand here with you because my heart is leaping with joy at the thought of resurrection and the reality of death. Brothers and sisters, I want to leave a minute of silence. And I would love for you to just gather some thoughts. I want to acknowledge that for some of us, we would have questions, and we'll have a microphone going around if you'd like to ask them, but also acknowledge some may have questions they don't want to ask on a microphone. And please text me. I think there it is. Yeah, it's on the screen. Please text me your questions if you have any that you'd like. We've just got sort of 20 minutes to sort of reflect together, share together. Maybe you've got a word that you felt stirred by. I did hear a preach it a couple of times, so maybe you want to testify to that. I've got 1,000 questions, Jack, but I've had the privilege of spending time with you, so I don't want to be selfish.
And you
with
scare
that.
me a little bit, I have to admit.
I get that a lot.
No. So we sat on our back porch drinking coffee and watching the deer, and Daz would say, "Oh, have you read this book?" I'm like, "No." "Okay, well, this is a really great book. Have you read this book?" I'm like, "No." So there are a lot of reasons you scare me.
Thank you for not mentioning my size, Jack. That's great. So brothers and sisters, take a minute to reflect and fire off your questions. I'll just leave some silence so we can gather our thoughts and marinate in that beautiful hope. Well, I might. Do we have the mics roving at all? Do we have them moving around? Awesome. Does anyone have a question they want to ask? Right, via microphone. Oh, that's some good questions. Oh, they're firing in now. Oh man, there's so many good questions. I feel like the most important one though at the moment is. Oh, great. Awesome. Ian.
So can I ask mine? I did text it to you.
Okay, yes.
I understand death, all right? So a few names. Enmore Church of Christ went years ago. I don't even know what year it was founded. Taree closed, I think, last year, the year before, 1865. Lismore closed in 2018, like it was established 1884. These were the oldest churches in the network in the state. So my question is, what does the resurrection body look like?
We began with the easy one, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question that was easy to ask I got first was,
That's right.
what's my shoe size? So, 14, if you're wondering. Sorry, Ian.
I think it's the right question. And my answer is not, I'm not fudging the answer, but I'm going to tell you the truth as I know it. The only ones who are experts in what the resurrected church looks like, which is your congregation, are the people in your congregation. Because every congregation is uniquely gifted. God has given your congregation a unique set of gifts and opportunities, and no other church in the world is like yours. Part of the giftedness is who's there, because when in the New Testament we talk about gifts, Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, 1 Peter 4, gifts are in general not skills or talents, but people. So who has God given you? And what kind of skills and talents do they bring? And what are the unique opportunities that God has given you? Who do you know? Where do you work? Where do you live? Who are your constellation of friends? Because that's what God is going to transform. And I mean, there are some things obviously are going to be in common. It's not going to be program driven, but Jesus driven. But what it will look like really depends upon the church. So I know churches that ended up meeting in bars.
You don't know where I minister, but I minister in a bar.
That's right. Yeah, I have a friend who wrote a book called Crossing the Bar. And on a Sunday, the bars are closed, and so they meet at a bar and meet with people who go to bars. And that may not be your church. That may not be what your church looks like, but I know churches that are being transformed by it. And other churches will bring the giftedness of music, and other churches will start meeting in house churches and homes, and some churches will meet under a bridge where the homeless are. And so it will look different in every place. The question is, what is God up to here? Which is not a question that I ask in most of the years of my ministry, because most of the years of my ministry have been, what can I do to make us better? And it's the wrong question. The question is, what is God already doing? I know you've heard this language before. God's church does not have a mission. God's mission has a church. It's not a program that I do. Here's our missions program. We're going to do this outreach thing over here, and then we're going to build the institution beyond that. It is, what is God doing in our community, and let's join God in that work. But that means you have to be discerning what God is up to, and that's not a gift many of us have used much, but it is the gift that we need. Okay, that may not have answered your question, but it's the best I've got.
We have so many questions, Jack, and I want to say we'll actually address them. So I'm going to pin Jack down, and we're going to get every answer to these questions
Great.
at some point.
Great, yeah.
Because
I hope you have some books to recommend.
There are
yeah.
some profound questions, seriously, and we've got 12 minutes. Is there anyone else on a mic? Anyone else want to sort of open a... Because I do have, plenty. Okay, I'm going to go to one of these ones.
Daz, we do have one.
Oh. Jono.
Hey. I think it's our hope that, as Jesus points out, the things that need to be put to death, not my child, and see where the resurrection is, that would embrace that. I wonder, across the American culture, Australian culture, the world, there's a lot in society and culture that is trying to put to death Christian, church, our way of life. Can you identify anything that you go, there's actually some things that they're trying to put to death that we should embrace? Because we'll embrace the Jesus putting to death in his form, but are there some things that our world is trying to put to death that we actually need to start embracing?
Wow.
There's your next book.
Yes. Okay, Des. Right.
Well, I was reading this one book, Jack.
You have to learn not to ask yes/no question. Okay. Let me give an example or two. The church that Lisa and I were a part of in Dallas before we moved to San Antonio was a predominantly African American church, a black church. We were the only white members, so when I say predominantly, we thought for a while that there was just a difference in style. This is interesting. We're kind of in another subculture, and we sing songs differently, etc. It had nothing to do with style. That was a church that filled with people who knew what suffering meant, who know what it means to be called names, to know what it means to be overlooked. What I hope that church would never lose is its connection to suffering, because they know the relationship between suffering and joy. They are more joyful than any other church we've ever been to because they suffer so much. The things that I hope we will never give up are the things that are most intimately tied to Christ's life and death. And so that will mean whatever it looks like in our congregation service, in which every disciple in the congregation is serving, not just having a few people do the serving for. For churches like ours, I certainly hope we don't give up our ties to baptism and supper, but we do it for the right reasons, not because we're supposed to, but because we are transformed by it, and because it works from the inside out, that we then do in our service and sacrifice for others what Christ has done in his service and sacrifice to us. That's a beginning. It's a beginning point. That's worth spending some time thinking about. What an extraordinary question.
Yeah, it's good, Jono. And I think actually some of it will be addressed, like as we go through the panel and some other things today around things that the society are and we should be perhaps embracing, as your question is, rather than resisting. What is it to... Yeah, I think that's actually some of that will be addressed in the next little bit too. There's heaps of questions, Jack. We've got 8 minutes, but trying to join them as I'm going. But how do I preach dying without getting fired?
Because that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? I used to tell my students in preaching classes back when preaching was theory and not lived, that a preacher, it's true for all kinds of ministries, but a preacher has 3 or 4, but in this case, 3 primary roles and responsibilities. There's a prophetic role, a priestly role, a pastoral role. The priestly role is serving the people and acting on God's behalf, and there may be a lot of small things. Making sure that we're just noticing how things are set up and how everything is arranged, and everyone is in a position where they can hear and listen. There are just certain tasks that a person can do, and you just serve the church quietly and know what it has to know. The pastoral role is giving up your life for the sake of the church and for the sake of the world. It is listening and marrying the children and burying the dead and praying for those who are sick and walking alongside of someone in grief and helping with marriages that are breaking apart or broken. And then there's a prophetic word, which is not telling the future, but speaking for God and doing so with boldness and power, recognizing that it's costly. Most preachers that I know of those 3 roles love the prophetic one because it's really exciting to preach a prophetic style sermon. But I tell you, if you do prophetic work and you overlook the priestly part, but especially the pastoral part, if you're not in the lives of the people, you deserve to be fired. But if you're in the lives of your people, that doesn't guarantee that you won't be fired for speaking God's truth, but it will be harder because you are in them and you are loved by them and you model listening and sacrifice. You don't stand over them and browbeat them. It's not like preachers, stand behind a pulpit like it's a bunker and throw hand grenades at the church. And that's not prophetic preaching. Preaching is getting down in the muck. It's being with. Preaching is alongside, not over. Even prophetic preaching. And so I would say there's no guarantee that you won't be fired. But for all of the right reasons, do your prophetic preaching, but do it out of your primary role as pastor. And what I normally say to my preaching students is, you probably shouldn't even attempt a pastoral sermon for a couple of years because you don't even know the church yet. You don't know them until you've been in the mud with them. Then maybe you have a chance to be a prophet, and then maybe you have a chance to do so without a pink slip.
That's good, Jack. There's a couple of questions around your 500-year cycle observation, and the thread of these couple of questions are, there does seem to be deconstruction going on in many Christians' lives, and there are issues we're facing, abortion, LGBTQ, plus all these other things. What is going on in regards to the death of past belief systems? And as I bridge that to this one, have we interpreted wrongly about what God is against? That's a great one for you.
And we have how many minutes?
The bell gift here, Jack, is you got 2.5.
Boy, that's a hard question, and if church leaders are not struggling with those questions, then they need to. For lots of reasons, not just because our world is changing dramatically. I mean, it was easier for me being a Christian in the 1950s. When everyone in our city was Christian in some sense. It was just easier. And then all we were doing is distinguishing ourselves, our type of Christians, from someone else's type of Christian and trying to persuade them that they were wrong and they needed to be like us. Because all that was at stake was just getting things right and making sure we had all the answers correctly. Part of the problem with that is we have a friend who is an accountant and began to calculate the odds of getting agreement, total agreement in a community of believers over 20 issues that commonly divide churches of Christ. That's just our tribe. The odds of everyone agreeing on all 20 of those issues are into the hundreds of millions. If agreement on all the issues is the goal, we are in deep trouble. And so, yes, there are a lot of things that cause us to rethink what we used to believe. When I was a baby preacher in not literally a baby, but my first preaching job in 1982, I knew most of the answers to most of the questions. And my job was to help our church come to the answers that I had already come to. And I now disagree with myself on most of the answers to the questions that I had then, partly because I studied Scripture, partly because the Spirit of God is at work, and partly because the change in culture has caused me to have to ask a set of questions I had no idea that I should have been asking all along. And so part of the answer is every question, every issue has to be asked again. And we have in our DNA an impulse to ask questions and investigate again. That we are not afraid to engage a controversial issue. That's our heritage. We haven't always done this well, but we're not afraid to engage it because we believe we can talk through, read through, study through, exegete through, interpret through, and come to answers based upon Scripture that may be different than what we used to think, and God be praised for that. That's a part of our heritage. What's not been part of our heritage in general is the other piece of that which is a sincere willingness to begin the question by saying, I may be wrong. I don't know for sure. I feel pretty sure, but I may be wrong. because that changes the conversation. You know, when someone says, "Well, the Bible says," right here, the Bible says, I want to think, well, I know, yeah, and you may be right. But the humility that says, I may be wrong, and then here's the hardest part, but this is a part of our story. Another person may come to a different understanding based upon his or her understanding of Scripture. And we may believe with all our hearts they are wrong on this. Can we be then a part of the same community of faith? Do we have to agree before we can be a people of welcome? Being a people of welcome when everyone looks like you, acts like you, thinks like you, talks like you is not much of a welcome.
Yeah, it's good.
That doesn't require anything. Being a people of welcome when you've got people in the church that think things profoundly differently than you do. And you are convinced with all your heart that they're wrong, and you love them and serve them and embrace them and are part of family together anyway. Now, that is a miracle that comes from God that will change the world.
Wow, let's finish there. Chuck a round of applause. Woo! Thank you so much, brother. Thank you.